brought back our panel to discuss the situation in Ferguson, and maybe a little bit longer discussion than we had planned. Juan, let me start with you. You had an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal this week in which you wrote about the racial fears and the real problems facing black men. Are the protesters in Ferguson focused on the wrong thing?
I don't know if they're focused on the wrong thing. I think there's a legitimate angst over the idea that a young man was shot 6 times and he's unarmed, and whether or not that was excessive lethal force, use of force by police, was it justified? So there's a real question, I think, for everybody, black and white, and I think that's why you've seen the outpouring. But what I wrote in the piece, Chris, was the interaction between police and poor black men in specific is a real window on racial fears in the United States, because we see this not just in Ferguson. We've had recent incidents in New York, L.A. You think back to Trayvon Martin. And the fear, I think, on the part of the conservative, white, mostly white community is that the line between the law-abiding and the lawless is really the police, and you must support the police and give them the benefit of the doubt. On the black side of this equation, I think there's fear of intimidation, harassment being legitimized by the fact that there is a high rate of crime, especially among young black men. #1 cause of death, young men, black men 15 to 34, murder. Who's committing the murder? Not police, other black men. Similarly, high rates of violence in terms of assault, robbery, those kinds of violent crimes. Again, young black men. But we don't talk about this fear, and I really think it's such a sin and a shame in this era. The civil rights community, black political leadership, is reluctant to talk about this, even though it so negatively impacts, well, where I live, in the black community. It creates fear, but we don't talk about it because they think, oh, this will feed the right wing and their anger and give permission to police to abuse and racially profile black men.
Once again, in the wake of Ferguson, we saw how sharp the disparity is between the white community and the black community. I want to put up a poll that came out from Pew this week. Pew is a research firm. 18% of blacks have confidence in the investigation of Michael Brown's shooting. 18%, while 76% do not have confidence in that investigation. Among whites, 52% have confidence, while 33% do not. Laura, how do you explain that really striking disparity, and what can we do about it?
Well, that's a tough nut to crack. I mean, President Obama obviously came in as a great healer, uniter, pledging that, we'd work together. It was a new day in America, and that really hasn't come to pass. I will say that I've been reading a lot of the comments from the business owners, most of them minority business owners in Ferguson, and good people, hardworking people, have had no beauty parlor open for the last 2 weeks, have lost business, and people saying, I can't do this anymore. So we saw what happened in Cincinnati, right, after the big riots in Cincinnati about a decade ago or so. Cincinnati was devastated. It took a long time to come back. It's just coming back now. I think whatever your view is on the officer or what happened with Michael Brown, we don't know yet. But what we do know is these communities need jobs. They need economic growth. They need, I think, and to some extent, a spiritual revival. This is about families coming together. If this police officer committed a crime, the police officer should do the time. I think the more we as non-minorities say that, I think, perhaps we can engage better. But I also think, there's a lot of demonization going on out there on both sides. Demonization of the police, many of them minorities in these communities, maybe not in Ferguson.
Not in Ferguson.
No, but in L.A., in Denver, in Phoenix. We have police officers putting their lives on the line every day, and to speak on their behalf is not to be a racist. We need good police to have judgment, and perhaps body cameras are the answer here. Would probably have a lot more answers if he was wearing a body camera. I do think that our country needs to start coming together. I know this sounds like a wishful thinking, but given the threats that we're seeing overseas that could be coming across our porous border right now, all of us need to come together for an economic and spiritual family revival. That's what I think is going on.
Carl, Attorney General Holder visited Ferguson this week and very pointedly said, I understand, not that I condone or agree with, but I understand the mistrust you have in the police department, and he talked about some cases where he had been profiled. Afterwards, he met, you can see it here on the screen, with Captain Ron Johnson of the State Highway Patrol, who's in charge of the police effort, who said that he thought that Holder and the fact that the grand jury was beginning to hear actual evidence were the two major factors in calming the situation in Ferguson. Do you think Holder did a good job?
I think he did something of a good job. We have two narratives here. One narrative emerging from the black community that the police killed a young black man who was approaching with his arms up saying, "Don't shoot." We have a second narrative, which is we have a violent young black man who assaulted a police officer, and the police officer felt threatened. We won't know until the justice system works its way through which narrative is correct. I think Holder did a good thing by going to the community and saying, as a chief law enforcement officer in the country, I understand where you're coming from because I have felt racial prejudice in my own life, even when I was a prosecutor. If I was going to be critical, though, I would say this. I was worried about some of the words that he used. He said, we can't have a conversation about what happened on August 9th, and sometime in December, nothing has happened. And the world is watching because the issues raised by the shooting of Michael Brown predate this incident. He would have been better off had he said, I understand where you're coming from because I've suffered this myself, and I'm going to make certain that justice is done and we'll get to the bottom of this. Instead, it sounded like he was putting his thumb on the scale saying, this young black man did not deserve to die and we're going to get this cop.
Bob?
Well,
a little over a minute. Basically, your takeaway on Ferguson.
I mean, I think you have to think about remedies. And if you talk to police chiefs or policemen who've been in the business a long time, they'll say the remedy here is police training. So you get officers in a situation where their first instinct is not to use the gun and fire. And there is a way, there's a reality here that Chris is having trouble getting.
No, go ahead.
You have no sound.
No, I can hear you.
So I think it's something that you know everyone can do better on. I think Holder going there actually did work, and that's an example of you know somebody a political intervention that is pretty successful.
I want to thank all of you for jumping in here as we were solving our